Maayad ha, anlaw ta inyo alan. We are the Group 7 and we are here to report the topic that is assigned to us. And we also assigned to the tribe Umayamnon, or which also called the people of the Umayan River. But before we start to discuss our topic, I'd like to introduce our group members. I am Clifford Lutrago, together with my group members Armar Jun Acuzar, James Rymarc Bagasbas, Jesame Sawan-on, Rica Mae Lucino, and Dapaton. And also, I would like to introduce our table of contents. So this would be the topics that we are going to discuss to you all. So the number one is the Umayamnon tribe. So first, we would like to give you some hints about what is Umayamnon, and especially this is the tribe that is assigned to us. Second is the necessary decouplings. Third is the lumad and the state of war machine. Fourth is the lumad and land of ownership. Fifth is beyond industria. And last is a new formulation. So based on our research, what is all about Umayamnon tribe? So in Umayamnon tribe, they have this what they call panigwas ritual. The panigwas ritual is a ritual performed invoking the success of an activity or event. The blood of the pig and the chicken will be poured on the ground as offering to the spirits so that they will not interrupt the activity. They have also what they call the kahimunan. The kahimunan is an Umayamnon word for kaamulan. It has the same meaning with the kaamulan in the Bukidnon, Higaonon, and Talandig dialect. So that would be all. So now let's start with our topic. Necessary decouplings. The true story of the Filipino nation is yet to be completely written. But the major narrative trends of this story are already well established. A century ago, our colonizers came and conquered and co-opted the local elite. Since then, our political and social culture has been a reflection of the distortion of an economy ruled by foreign interests in cahoots with landed and local elite. So what does the Lumad narrative tell us about the journey of the Filipino nation? The consequence of which for majority of the Filipino is their continuing economic marginalization and suffering in revolving regimes of predatory elite rule. But there is an important aspect to this story, one that we may have missed to account for in our attempts to understand the whole tapestry of narratives of the Filipino nation. Within this nation that by all accounts remain to be flawed and deeply divided, there are those who have been pushed to the margins of national life, their culture, and the resources appropriated for the goals of national development that ultimately benefit the few. A continuing complacency and incapacity to understand the Lumad manifest our ignorance and collective scorn over our shared history as a people oppressed. Their narrative of oppression and their contemporary plight as the disposed of glaring omission in the dominant national consequences. Before we proceed to the next slide, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Armar Jun Acuzar.
The Lumad in the State War Machine. Some matters need to be stated. The Lumad and other indigenous people of Mindanao are the most disadvantaged sector historical in the present. The ongoing state-led era of accumulation by disposition. Their fate as victim of this historical and systematic process of marginalization is tied to political and economic shift emanating from the global to the local. The move to render them extinct through the state war machine indicate what we may irreversible those made this neoliberal onslaught. There are concerted efforts to erase them ideologically and physically from the national imaginary. The attempt to divorce them from their struggle over their land and resources through the formation of state-backed Lumad groups and other sectors creating features among their ranks is one ploy. Another is to discard what the term Lumad has come to mean by discoupling it from their historical struggle over land and resources. The Lumad from Mindanao is good only as a cultural marker of an ideal time that has gone by. They are of no use asserting their rights against big business or even as activists who have come to embrace a more comprehensive and political view of their situation and that of others.
Thank you, Mr. Armar. Before I proceed, I would like to give the floor to Miss Jesame Sawan-on to report her assigned topic.
The Lumad and land ownership. Their experience has in fact a lot to teach us in terms of how we could imagine an alternative national order. One of the long-lasting and structural consequences of colonization was the imposition of private property relations to the local economy. According to Gaspar, from a regard for land that was a trusteeship or stewardship, this was supplanted with individual ownership rights during colonization and became the based of landlord-serf relations. So this passage talks about how colonization changed how people owned land. Before, the land was shared or looked after by leaders for everyone's benefit, but when the colonizers came, they made individuals own the land instead. This made some people landlords who had power over others who worked on the land. The colonizers also used middlemen called kibsas to control the land. This changed how leaders cared for their communities because now they cared more about themselves and what the colonizers wanted. Even after colonizations, these changes affected how the local economy worked. This trait would endure even after the departure of the Spaniards, tolerated and even strengthened by the Americans, and essentially defined the dynamics between and among the members of the modern Principalia and the Filipino masses in the post-war era up to the present. So according to Gatmaitan 2005 in Aguilar and Oson, there is a contrary view presented by a number of scholars who assert that our indigenous peoples have a private property concepts on land and therefore challenge the myth of communal land tenure. And it is their assertion that the Manobos, for instance, hold private land ownership concepts that may be contrary to the implied assumptions for the 1997 Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. One of the arguments cites the prevalence of Datu or community chieftains who are allowed to own more land than the rest of community. Gaspar presents studies comparing the land laws of the Manobo and Kalinga tribes, highlighting their criminal land ownership practices. To counter arguments by Gatmaitan and others, Gaspar refers to Martiniza's study among the Hanunos of Mindoro. This study illustrates how cultural interactions between indigenous and lowland societies led to a mix of feudal and capitalist economic systems. Alongside the introduction of private land ownership, additionally, Gaspar mentions a case study conducted among the Banwaon people of Agusan del Sur. This study reveals the Banwaon's resistance to adopting private land ownership as they struggle against their dato who seeks to claim land for personal gain. The debate over whether communal land ownership truly existed is ongoing. But what's undeniable is the lasting harm caused by what O.D. Corpus referred to as the landlord-serf double economy enforced by colonial rule. This system has deeply marginalized the Lumad people throughout history. Studying Lumad culture carefully can show us different paths forward. Their resistance against the state and private interest trying to assimilate them highlights the need to preserve what's at risk of disappearing. It also prompts us to consider alternatives that have existed all along, waiting for us to embrace and develop.
Thank you, Miss Jesame Sawan-on. Before we proceed to next slide, I would like to give the floor to Mr. James Rymarc Bagasbas to report to us his assigned topic.
Beyond Industria. There is also the tendency among many to look at the situation of the Lumad in Mindanao and indigenous peoples in general through rose-colored lenses. There are those afflicted by a hidden romanticism in understanding indigenous peoples, plight, and just like idealist philosophers Rossio and Thoreau, they are seen as noble savages that deserve to remain untouched and uncontaminated by the vagaries of this modern life. So this paragraph highlights the people are drawn to the Lumad because they symbolize innocence and purity, serving as a reminder of society's guilt for mistreating the marginalized. Additionally, there's a subconscious longing to escape to an idealized past, which contributes to the desire to protect them. There is a rich social subconscious behind such impulses. Many feel for the Lumad because they represent an idealization of the innocent and pure amongst us, and the desire to come towards their protection is at once a function of guilt over what we have done to the most marginalized in society. At the same time, our subliminal pining for collective flight to an imagined bygone era. The unexpressed desire is for a social time machine wherein reality can be winded backwards to a time prior to industrialization and environmental destruction, before the peasants were shackled to labor over land for their vassals and kings, before people were divided between the two distinct classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, towards the imagined Blue Lagoon paradise before we were banished to the drab, grey, paranoid android reality of the modern present. But sadly, there is no such time machine nor can society carry backwards because no such idealized period ever existed. The great thinker Karl Marx said that the history of man has always been a history of struggle. First, against the challenges posed by scarcity in a harsh environment. When a human society devised the material and social arrangement to resolve these problems, it became a struggle of man versus his fellow men for the resulting surplus resources in the form of competing classes. So it describes an unspoken longing for a return to a pre-industrialized era, free from environmental destruction and social class divisions. It evokes a desire for a simpler, more idyllic past before the complexities and challenges of modern society arose. That is why there are many who argue the left discourse is equally dangerous to indigenous peoples and their culture. The social Darwinist and modernist slant in Marxist thought is the basis for this fear. Native American author Leslie Marmon Selko argues that indigenous peoples' concerns are not compatible with Marxism, since both model requires the exploitation of natural resources and industrial development that conflict with indigenous ideas about the sacred nature of the earth. Marx himself supposedly thought that simple forms of production relations, from where indigenous peoples are classified under, were destined to disappear in the march of societies towards industrialization and capitalism, and later on, socialist construction. He anticipated that in the evolutionary processes of human societies, all classes will eventually fall into two broad categories, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Given the inherent contradiction between the conflicting classes, they will finally come into a dialectical resolution in the classless stage of communism. So it suggests some leftist ideologies like Marxism pose a threat to indigenous peoples and their cultures due to their emphasis on social Darwinism and modernization. According to the Native American author Leslie Marmon Silko, indigenous concerns clash with Marxist principles, as both advocate for the exploitation of natural resources and industrial development, which contradicts indigenous beliefs and the sacredness of Earth. This is the belief and promise according to some ardent proponents of Marxism, such that if the relations of production do not reflect these progressive stages, they must be brought to that state through socialist planning and reconstruction. According to Ian Bayard, cites the case of Laos where state-led primitive accumulation of the self-described Marxist state in putting great pressure on countries' indigenous peoples who are well on their way towards proletarianization. The process represents a massive social upheaval where changing socio-economic conditions give birth to new rules. For example, older women used to help with the fields, but they are now without their land while not being allowed to participate in the wage labor economy due to being classified as too old to work for the rubber companies. Many point to the fact that they previously worked their own hours, but now have little choice but to send some family members to work for the very companies that stole their land. So it describes how much Marxists believe that if the current production relations don't match progressive stages, they should be adjusted through socialist planning. It mentions Laos as an example where state-led accumulation, influenced by Marxism, is pressuring indigenous peoples into proletarianization, causing significant social upheaval and emergence of new socio-economic rules. For instance, older women who used to work in fields now face displacement without land or opportunities in the wage labor economy, contributing to family members working for companies that seize their land. This orthodox view of the modern progression of human societies hews very closely, as Bayard observes, to liberal views of John Locke and his regard for the Native Americans who, unable to produce profit from their labor on the land, must be subjected to the improvement of their economic activities to become at par with that of the European settlers. What is happening in Laos? Bayard continues in a version of state capitalism not unlike what the IMF, World Bank, and ADB are imposing in other parts of the world. The difference is that in Laos, it is the state which manages the process of accumulation by dispossession, whereas in other parts of the globe, it is the transnational corporations who oversee the reap dividends from this process. It suggests that the orthodox view of societal progression parallels John Locke's perspective, which advocated for improving the economic activities of Native Americans to match European settlers. In Laos, this translates into a form of state capitalism where the government manages the process of disposition-driven accumulation. This mirrors the practices of international financial institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and ADB in other regions, where transnational corporations oversee and benefit from similar processes of disposition.
So thank you, Mr. Rymarc. So before we proceed to next slide, I would like to give the floor to Miss Hani Dapaton.
Such observations highlight the conflicting modes of understanding the place of indigenous people from what appears to be both the left and right discourses. There is such a thing as state-sponsored capitalism whose aim is to generate surplus from available resources at the expense of the indigenous people and the environment. There is also the neoliberal onslaught that appear to occur in a far larger scale and in many instances imposed with such impunity. Such dilemma will surface if the horizon of our political imagination is limited only to the model of industria, the Western prototype of industrialized societies, that certain kinds of left and right thinking are still hung over. 100 years hence, such vision has only created a world with three kingdoms: the first world, the global south, and within these spaces, the underclass among the underclass. The indigenous people of the world against whom are waged mechanisms of structural and historical marginalization, or should I say, wars of extinction. It is still, however, left discourse, despite its shortcomings, which offer the most comprehensive analysis of the workings of the enduring dynamics of accumulation by dispossession and thus point the way forward. While we search for new model and alternatives, the plight of the most marginalized direct us to a new horizon. The Lumad in particular and the indigenous people in general do not really comprise a special category of people that intrinsically distinguish them from the rest of the oppressed population. Their otherness originates from the fact that they are global capitalism's most marginalized contemporary victims. In his book, The Nomad's Struggle in the Face of Globalization, Carl Gaspar laments the social upheavals that the indigenous people of Mindanao face as their politics, culture, and economy are violently transformed by the coupling the local economy to the global economic order. Subsistence may have to give way to surplus production. Kinship relations that previously determined both the forms of access to resources and labor processes might have to give way to class relations. Local barter systems may have to give way to a more complicated system over which they have very little control. A more community-oriented way of sharing resources may have to completely give way to individual accumulation of wealth. A manner that respects the rhythms of the ecosystems may have to give way to an extractive form of exploitation that will ultimately spell big troubles for all creatures to the archipelago. The emancipation of the Lumad involves a necessary process of decoupling from the vestiges of colonialism and neocolonialism that tied Mindanao to the global economic order, which necessitates as well a withdrawal, violent or otherwise, against the hold of a violent, predatory state of the elites. To reverse Gaspar's lamentations and hopeful of an emancipated future through the Lomads and all oppressed people practices of resistance and the achievement of their right to self-determination. We can now imagine an alternative future where surplus production may have to give way to food security. Class relations might have to give way to communal relations in providing access to labor and resources. The complicated trade system may have to give way to a system that is within the community's control. The individual accumulation of wealth may have to give way to community-oriented way of sharing. And the extractive form of exploitation may have to give way to a manner that respects the rhythms of the ecosystems.
Thank you, Miss Honey. Before we proceed to the next slide, I would like to give the floor to Miss Rica Lucino.
On October 12 to 28, 2016, 3,000 delegates from the indigenous groups of Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao have gathered together to forge an alliance amongst themselves as members of our country's national minority groups. The previous years saw the rise of the Lumad, referring to Mindanao's non-Moro indigenous people, in the national consciousness. The Manilakbayan of the past years saw the indigenous peoples of Mindanao take the pilgrimage of thousands of kilometers from the southern island to the nation's capital in order to dramatize the issue of extrajudicial killings, encroachment of big businesses into their ancestral domains, and the militarization of their communities leading to their collective displacement as a people. This time around, the Lumad are now joined by the Moro and other indigenous groups all over the country. As part of this year's activity, they have dubbed Lakbayan 2016 or the Lakbayan ng Pambansang Minorya para sa Sariling Pagpasya at Makatarungang Kapayapaan. From October 12 to 28, 2016, they engage in a series of activities that were meant to convey to the Filipino public their collective situation as members of our country's minorities facing the same forms of national oppression. While we search for new models and alternatives, the plight of the most marginalized direct us to a new horizon. The Lumad in particular and indigenous people in general do not really comprise a special category of people that intrinsically distinguish them from the rest of the oppressed population. Their otherness originates from the fact that they are global capitalism's most marginalized contemporary victims. The pilgrimage and the coming together of the Moro and the indigenous people of the Philippines are dramatizations of an important historical truth that has finally come to the surface. Together, they represent the most marginalized among the Filipino people and are, in fact, facing the same issues of historical and structural marginalization in varying degrees. These national minority groups have limited access to social services and experience militarization and the encroachment of foreign mining and agricultural expansion into their ancestral lands. One of the important unities forged is that the Lumad and Moro from Mindanao and other indigenous groups such as the Aitas, Igorots, and Mangyans from Luzon, together with the Ati and the Tumandoks of Visayas, have decided to band together under the banner of the Sandugo Alliance, a throwback to the anti-colonial solidarity forged by our indigenous forefathers amongst themselves versus the onslaught of the colonialism. Forging an alliance to face together colonialism's enduring contemporary manifestations by combating the appropriation and plunder of their ancestral lands of foreign interests, often with the backing and complicity of the Philippine nation-state, is the new unity amongst our national minority groups who have come together under the Sandugo Alliance. For observers of social movements in the Philippines, this is an illuminating moment in terms of clarifying the relationship of national minority groups to the feudal and elite-led Philippine state. The tendency before was to appeal to the varied specificities of each minority group's history and struggle. When there is a common denominator that underlines these marginalized groups' historical experience, it is high time that the conversation between our minority groups has shifted from an emphasis on uniqueness to that of commonalities. The emerging conclusion from these conversations is the agreement that what fuels their shared marginalized has been the plunder of their resources by foreign interests with the complicity of our elite-led state.
Thank you for that, Miss Rica. Before we proceed to last slide, may we call on back Mr. Armar Acuzar.
There is much to learn from the experience of our national minorities since they have launched the most fearsome models of resistance against imperialism past and continuing onslaught. These lessons are enriched as they continue in their journey towards self-determination. Together, they represent the most marginalized among the Filipino people and are, in fact, facing the same issues of historical and structural marginalization. The Lumad are now at the front lines of struggle not only for their own cause but also for the cause of others who join them.
And that would be all. Thank you. We hope that you have coped up some learnings through our report. And before we end this video, once again, I am Clifford Lutrago, together with my group members, Jesame Sawan-on, James Rymarc Bagasbas, Armar Jun Acuzar, Rica Mae Lucino, and Hani Dapaton. We are the Group 7, telling you all, daghang salamat.